Retro vibes for the modern mind. Welcome to NeoNostalgia with Craig and Ray. Your hosts talk pop culture from the 40s to the 90s. Tune in, have fun, and heck, you might even learn something. Well, let's not get crazy. Take it away, Craig and Ray.
Gonna have a little fun with this intro, folks. Hey, guys and gals, welcome to the NeoNostalgia podcast. You know me, I'm the nerd guy, Ray Keating, and I'm here with that cool cat, Craig D'Onofrio. Before we dive into this episode, let's answer the big question. What the heck is NeoNostalgia anyway? Neo means new, and nostalgia is an affection for the past. That's right, we talk pop culture from the 40s to the 90s, covering movies, TV, music, advertising, radio, food, home life, and novels. What more could you ask for? In fact, don't ask for any more. Don't get greedy. Put them together, and we enjoy and learn some stuff from pop culture of the past. In this show, this episode, Craig, once a Southern California rocker himself, is going to take us on a journey. A journey where? Back to the birth of rock and roll. Crazy, right? We're going to talk about the big stars that people still remember, as well as those who were big at the dawn of rock, but too many people have simply forgotten. And yes, those folks deserve better. Craig, baby, take us back when radio broke new ground and upset parents with stacks of wax that brought rock and roll out of the underground and into the mainstream.
Wow. That is quite an intro, Ray. I got to say, you worked on that, didn't you? I mean, there's some craftsmanship that went behind that.
Wow.
That's
all right.
quality.
I like that. Thank you.
Yeah. So today we're talking about the birth of rock and roll, and we're going to go all the way up to the British invasion of the 1960s, early 60s. The year of 1964, by the way, a great year. The Beatles came to America, and Craig D'Onofrio emerged from his mother's womb. So there you have it.
What a year.
Same
the
year.
Beatles and Craig.
Greatest years in history right there. That's
I don't want to say it. I mean, I'm a downer. I was born in 63. So unfortunately, C.S. Lewis died and so did JFK. So
oh, man.
Yeah. Wow. So
that's a drag.
Yeah,
you're a drag, man. Total drag.
Let's get back to the fun stuff.
Yeah. So coming out of World War II, the music was very nice. We were kind of chatting about this before the show. It was nice. You had Perry Como, some of my favorites. Don't get me wrong. I love these guys. The Rat Pack, Dino was so smooth. And you had Bing Crosby, of course, that was World War II era and all that. But you had very nice, safe love songs, romance, all sorts of good stuff like that. Coming out of World War II, though, the world had changed. And there's a new class called teenagers. They didn't really exist before that. When you were a kid, and then you went to work. And a lot of times our parents, grandparents, they just dropped out of school and got a job because the family needed the income. They had to put food on the table. Now all of a sudden there's disposable income. The economy's booming. Of course, Ray can explain that to you. He's an economist, but I, on the other hand, studied economy, but I don't understand it. So, regardless.
Many economists are that way as well. But
penny saved is a penny earned. That's about all I remember. Some Austrian dudes also. But regardless, there's this rise of the teenager that comes, and these kids have time and money, and they can buy records, things they couldn't afford in the past, little luxuries. And with this comes a change in the culture. So there's something that is going on, a little bit of rebellion that wasn't there before. Of course, kids were rebellious before, but if they were working all day, putting in a 40-hour work week, they didn't really have time to do stupid stuff like I did. And so it is that the kids are feeling a little rambunctious. They're feeling a little misunderstood. Of course, that's what having too much time on your hand does. And so there comes a collision of cultures between mom and dad, the greatest generation, and the baby boomers. And even these early baby boomers are really trying to figure things out.
Well, they wouldn't even be baby boomers, would they? I mean, I guess. I mean, not really. I mean, well, when are you talking about? I mean, early 60s.
I mean, if you're looking at the earliest days of rock and roll actually are kind of hatched in the late 40s, early 50s. So no, they're not boomers. But then when you get into 1955, the rise of Elvis and these others, they're kind of, the kids are 14, 15 years old. I think that fits
Right.
in the boom. So yeah, pretty close. So it is that this collision happens as there's this R&B, gospel, jazz, boogie woogie kind of thing going on. A little bit of the African American influences that aren't flying so well in white America. And then there's country music. And country music is where a lot of stuff is happening. But when all of this comes into play, something really interesting happens. Now, you have some early people like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who, if you don't know who she is, go on YouTube and check it out, because this old gal could really wail on the guitar. And she did until she was in her 80s. She was playing,
Wow.
yeah, I mean, there's some great videos of her in the 1950s playing, her 60s, even playing like a Gibson SG, and just really, she had those licks that Eddie Van Halen admired very much. And she was very influential in the early days of rock and roll, especially amongst guitarists. So she was very gifted. She sang gospel music, but man, with a really serious edge. And then, of course, there was Chuck Berry and Little Richard. And these guys were kind of establishing the foundations of what Elvis Presley and Bill Haley would latch on to. It became rock and roll. Now, you had on the black side people like Chuck Berry and Little Richard, and then you had this nice white boy who was handsome, and yet he had a little bit of that backwoods Southern thing going on. A guy named Elvis Presley, you've heard about him. And Elvis was what the record companies were really looking for. Someone who could play that black music, but be white at the same time. And so along comes Elvis. And Bill Haley, I think he was a teacher or something, an engineer, teacher or something. He wasn't really a rock and roller, but he comes along also and really sets the world on fire. And of course, we'll talk about in the bonus episode a gal that I love, Wanda Jackson, the sweet lady with a nasty voice is what they called her. And she had a growl. She was actually Elvis's girlfriend for a while, and really interesting gal. Ended up, when rock and roll, that first wave was dying, she went back toward country and gospel music and actually became kind of a traveling evangelist, but really an interesting lady. But all of this comes to a mainstream with this rebellion of the American teenager, this new class with disposable income and leisure time. And beyond entertainment, the music played a pivotal role in the American civil rights music by breaking down racial barriers, of course, coming between white and black, a place where people could come together. You have these amazing black musicians who are playing this rock and roll right next to the white musicians. Bands start to become integrated, which is crazy in this culture that of the 1950s and early 60s. And then, of course, comes the rise of Motown, where you have another round of integration. What's that, Ray?
I want to ask, because I've been reading some stuff on this, not to your extent, your knowledge, and I saw an episode of our friend that I know you like him as well, Professor of Rock, Adam Reeder.
Yeah, he's an amazing guy.
He was talking about 1955 in particular, as that moment of the birth of rock and roll. And he was talking about how often songs would be written and then multiple acts would put them out there.
Yep.
And what happened at that time, being the time it was, unfortunately, was that you would have a black group or a black singer do a song, and then a record label turn around and find a white person or a white group to do it. So that was kind of interesting and revealing, not surprising, but that's the reality of those days. And well, let me get your response on that, and then I have another question for you.
I'm drawing a blank. Pat Boone did a cover.
Yeah, Pat Boone. Fats Domino did a song. That was it.
Domino. Is that
Fats Domino did a song. I can't remember which one it was.
Yeah.
And then they turned around and had Pat Boone do the same song. And when you hear them, I mean, Fats Domino's song version is better. But interestingly, at least according to what I was reading and listening to Professor Rock, is that, you know, what was, if you want to call it encouraging or groundbreaking, was that as much as the record labels would do that, the renditions by the black performers also scored high on the charts.
Yeah.
So that's
I remember seeing
that's
something
that
on
sign of things breaking down. And, you know, it's interesting when you look at that time period of, you know, sometimes we underestimate it, but how much pop culture can change things. I mean, you think about what was going on in rock and roll. You think about what was going on, I mean, a little bit earlier, right, with Jackie Robinson and baseball.
Right.
These are all things that are entertainment, but they can have this impact, and sometimes it's not good, but oftentimes it's very good when you look at rock and roll and music and baseball, for example, and so on.
You're talking about this, and I'm trying to remember. I was watching something on that whole thing with Pat Boone and Fats Domino, and Fats Domino loved it because every time
his numbers went up,
his
right?
numbers kept going up. It's like, oh, I know that song, but this other guy is doing it. You know, it's so it actually was a interesting symbiotic relationship, I guess you could say, between the two of them. Yeah, no, and that's one of the things that you get when you have other people writing your music for you, right? You know, everybody's gonna lay the same tracks, so it's very interesting how that worked out.
Yeah, and it seems apparently it was more prevalent then in the 50s and the 60s to have that go on. It's kind of foreign to us, I think, if you came to music later on and more recently, that, you know, obviously people do covers and so on, but it's hard to think of, you know, two performers were in the top 10 with the same song at the same time. You know, that's just wild. It's just very strange.
Absolutely. And that happened more than once. You had two
it seemed to be a regular occurrence.
Really interesting. But when you have other people writing your music, you never know what's going to happen. You know, you think about Neil Sedaka performing so many of his own songs, but then the Monkees were playing his songs, and, you know, other people were playing his songs.
He wrote
too.
songs for them. Yeah, I mean, so many. Yeah.
So,
my other question for you is, you know, I knew this kind of, but I again, doing some reading and stuff, you know, there's a debate, right, about when was the true start of rock and roll, right? And who do you attribute it to? And I think I mean, I'm not steep in this at all. Okay. So this is just from 30,000 feet. But when you look at when Bill Haley and his Comets, when these songs hit, it's pretty hard to say that it was somebody else. I mean, all these guys were there, right? You know, you mentioned Elvis and so on and others. But when you look at his songs hitting the charts in 1954, and then, the Rock Around the Clock, which is the big one, and that was doing well, but then it became the opening song, I think, to the movie Blackboard Jungle.
Right.
And that was it. It just went through the roof. And when you look at that time period and how early he was doing things, I mean, there was one of the songs that I saw that made the charts, I think they mentioned in like 53. And 54 he was there and stuff. So, and that is
this goes back to like 51 with some of these people like Rosetta Tharpe. You know, she goes way, way back, and she's early pioneer of what we know as rock and roll.
Right. And that's, I guess, that underground angle, right? That it was there. But it seems like a lot of people that know better than me use that Blackboard Jungle, Rock Around the Clock as the demarcation. That's the place where rock and roll officially, you know, hit the scene and became rock and roll. And you know, when we talk about the stars and the forgotten, which are, you know, what you're, you know, in terms of this episode, how many people today remember Bill Haley and his Comets, right? I mean, you gotta, if you're a movie buff like we are, you know, maybe you watch Blackboard Jungle, right? If you're a music aficionado, you know it. I guess Rock Around the Clock, wasn't that the after the end song that they put on Happy Days for a while, I think,
Yep, they sure
as we
did.
went out?
And the thing that's interesting, you brought up Blackboard Jungle, and this goes back to the rise of the teenage culture,
Right.
that the kids were feeling misunderstood, because kids are always misunderstood. They
Right.
will always be misunderstood. But when that came on at Blackboard Jungle in the movie, kids would freak out in the movie theaters, and there's stories about kids taking switchblades and cutting up the seats and all crazy stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then, rock and roll really got a bad reputation because, that devil music, look at what it does to the children. It makes them crazy,
Right.
and that backbeat. The backbeat's a big part of it too. And if you don't know what that is, that's the 2 and 4 beat, right? So you have like 1, 2, 3, 4, and that whole drum beat just really, that's where you get your danceability out of and that sort of thing. So the kids are jumping up, dancing in the aisles, getting a little crazy. And so that devil rock and roll. And of course, the television is a brand new invention. You got the TV preachers. The devil music is bringing out the evil in our children, all that kind of stuff. And
and he was, I know I'm pushing Bill Haley for in his comments, but he was one of the early guys to do Ed Sullivan.
Yep.
So, and when you look at his song, there are songs that people, I think, still know, right? Rock Around the Clock, See You Later, Alligator. What are some of the, there are other ones that I can't think of right now, but Shake, Rattle and Roll, right? So those are songs that, I don't know, comes to mind to many people, but I think, the question is how many people know who sang it, and do they know the role that he played in the formation of rock and roll? And I'll give you a final thing on Bill. Part of what we do here is to direct people to these things, and you can go find it. It's the best of Bill Haley and his Comets, the 20th Century Bastards collection, the Millennium Collection. It's just a collection of his greatest hits. I listened to it today while I was driving around. It's good stuff, and people should refamiliarize themselves with this man who played, some people say, the key role in bringing rock and roll to the masses. If not, he certainly was one of the top, 2 or 3 people.
Yeah, absolutely. Ray Charles in 1954, I've Got a Woman. That was one of the early hits, so right around that same time.
That's that R&B, right? Bring it in R&B with
Bring it in the R&B.
And,
right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and that's what rock and roll was. It was a mashup of R&B, blues, country, God only knows what else, gospel.
That's probably some big band stuff in there, I would have to say, in terms of what you're listening to.
And that's something that, if you listen to Louis Prima, I mentioned all that nice music of World War II and post-World War II, Louis Prima's kind of a crossover. He's got a growl to his voice, and he's very upbeat. Of course, he's blowing his horn like a banshee, but he's a wild man for, as far as crooners go and that sort of thing. He's got a lot of, for an Italian guy, he's got a lot of soul.
and you can say that because your last name is D'Onofrio.
Yeah, that's right. My name ends with a vowel, so I can talk about other people's whose names end with vowels. But if you listen to Louis Prima in that day and age, you're probably wondering, is this guy white? I'm not sure. And the answer is he's Italian. So who knows?
Yeah.
But regardless, so you do start to have this crossover, and Louis is kind of late in the game as far as all those crooners go. He's kind of the 1950s guy, but he's bringing a little bit of the growl. And with this, you start to have this transition. So it's an interesting phenomena how all this works, but a lot of it continues to go back to the teenage culture that never really existed. And of course, not too far into this, we get the transistor radio. So no longer do you have to gather around the family radio in the living room. You got your little radio that you can have in your bedroom, and you can listen to your stuff. And you can be kind of private about it.
It's fascinating, right? I mean, there's always this factor where teenagers are listening to whatever the latest is on music, right? And you're right in terms of all the stuff you say, but it's also very interesting to think about, especially with the early rock and rollers. You know, Bill Haley, for example, was born in 1925. These guys weren't of that age group.
Right.
They're older, right? They're musicians. They're experimenting. So it's kind of a question of like, you know, chicken or the egg in certain ways, right? I mean, I don't think Bill Haley was experimenting in the sense of thinking about how can I hook those teenagers, right? He's doing what he thinks is, you know, really interesting, great music, and the same for some other. And now, of course, not to say that there aren't folks that certainly played that game, and I understand that, but in terms of the innovators, sure, there are some that might be thinking, oh, how can I appeal to that certain age group? But I think most of them are thinking about, whoa, look what we could do here. This is really interesting stuff, right? And we're going to put it out there and see what happens to it.
So it's also interesting that Alan Freed, DJ out of Cleveland, Ohio. That's why the Rock Hall of Fame is in Cleveland, because that's where the term rock and roll was originated for this music. Of course, it was back in R&B days, and in the black music, it was code for sex. But somehow along the way, Alan Freed mainlined it into the normal vocabulary of America and no longer meant that. And it was a style of music. So it's kind of interesting. I was mentioning that things like the transistor radio, also the little turntables that would play a 45 RPM record, you know, your singles and that sort of thing, the modern microphones, very different. You know, in the early days of rock and roll, Elvis or I don't know, pick one, the Man in Black himself. They go into a studio and you would have a microphone that the band would gather around. And the engineer would say, okay, you got to move the drums back 8 feet now. And the bass player's got to come forward 2 feet. And the guitar amp needs to move over, you know. And so they would kind of arrange everything around the microphone. But all of a sudden, there's a new microphone that's a dynamic microphone. It's a much better microphone. And now you have also a mixing console where you can have more than one microphone at a time. And so this really changes the way that things are recorded. Bing Crosby talks about this a bit, about how when these microphones started to come out, his whole way of singing changed tremendously. And if you listen to early Bing Crosby, he's a tenor baritone, but when he could get up on the microphone, he got that resonance and everything. And Bing would just really, you know, bring out that more bassy baritone and that sort of thing. So with the technology, everything is in flux. And radio is now very interesting. Like I said, Alan Freed popularized the rock and roll, and people are coming to DJs like Alan Freed and saying, hey, play my record. And he says, well, what's in it for me? Well, I got some steaks in the back of the car. How about a couple of steaks?
Yeah, he got in trouble for that, right?
Yeah, the old payola. Yeah. And he said, well, that's just the way we do business in radio. I don't understand the problem here, but apparently that's not kosher. So,
but from what I understand, that went on for long after him. So,
yeah, and it's still a thing today, but not as much because everything's corporate now. But so just a real evolution in technology and the culture, a lot of stuff going on. Of course, you also have different regions of the country doing different things. And you look down south in Memphis, Tennessee, Sun Records, with people like Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, Johnny Cash, Man in Black. I love Johnny Cash. Jerry Lee Lewis, all of these Southern boys down there. And so you got Sun Records in Memphis. Then up in Chicago, you've got Chess Records. And this is more of urban electric blues, sophisticated guitar-driven rock. You got Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, Muddy Waters, Howling Wolf, another one that you need to look up on YouTube, Howling Wolf. If you get a chance to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you just walk through the history of rock and roll there. It's really amazing. And, of course, then you have the rise of Motown, Hitsville, USA, in Detroit. And this was kind of, once again, a little more tame. Little less threatening because it tends to be black and they're trying to cross over into the white audience. And so you actually have a much more subdued thing with the Supremes, the Temptations, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder. Of course, this is coming into the late 50s now and 60s. So things are not quite as aggressive. Down in Memphis, you've got Stack Records, you've got Fame Studio, Muscle Shoals, Alabama, interesting place. You've got Wilson Pickett, Aretha Franklin, Percy Sledge. These are people who ended up kind of doing the Motown thing later on. So you have this transition going on where rock and roll is all the rage, but it really only lasts for about maybe 10 years before things start to really, really fall off. And a lot of that is, well, there are a lot of different things that happened.
So wait a second. You're saying that rock and roll 10 years in started to fall off? Is that your...
Yeah, because there were
Okay,
scandals
all
and deaths and other things, right? So early on, I mentioned Cicero Rosetta Tharpe, Chuck Berry, both early architects, Little Richard, very early on also. Elvis comes in as this crossover guy, and everything is just booming. And then the era starts to decline because of these setbacks in the late 50s. And this starts to lead a shift in the industry back to more comfortable, more safe music. Of course, you have the day that music died in 1959, that plane crash that killed Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper. And that hurt. That hurt really bad. You have Elvis being drafted into the Army in 1958. Little Richard had a terrible scare, if I remember right, on an airplane. And Little Richard became a devout Christian, and he became a preacher. But his career after 1957 really, really diminished because his whole world shifted. So his fame was very short-lived. And then you've got Jerry Lee Lewis, who got blacklisted because he married his 14-year-old cousin. And that's still not very acceptable.
Yeah.
And Chuck Berry got arrested in 1959. Alan Freed and the whole payola thing, 1959. So rock and roll took a serious hit because it became dirty in a lot of ways. And so you started to have a shift toward more comfortable, safe music once again. And so you have clean-cut white guys, Paul Anka, Fabian, Bobby Darin, very produced, very smooth, homogenized, almost back to the crooners. It's all very tame. And it's a little bit sad in a lot of ways.
I love Bobby Darin, Mac the Knife.
I do too. I love all these guys. I mean, Fabian, I don't know so much about, but Paul Anka, I was always, someone who likes.
So
Paul
is it
Anka.
just, is it just a, I mean, rock and roll didn't certainly go away. I mean, we see everything that comes after it. So is it just a shift because, away from the originators, if you will, for a whole host of reasons? So is it a shift or is it, I mean, obviously you're going to have generations. I mean, we see the history of rock and roll music and we see things change at various times very, very dramatically. So is it just a shift that you're talking about or
I kind of, the pendulum that swings, right? As a cultural pendulum, you see it in politics, you see it, but the pendulum swings and it goes one direction, but then when it comes back, it doesn't go all the way back to where it started. And I think that's kind of what's happening here. You have these guys, Bobby Darin, Fabian, and others, they kind of go back toward the crooners, but they don't go all the way back to the standards. They stop short. And then there's a rebellion and the pendulum swings and it goes a little further in the other direction again. And this is where you swing into Motown. And then the British invasion starts to bring hard rock. The Beatles kind of start kind of almost rockabilly early on, and then they do their own thing. And you have the Rolling Stones doing their own thing. And this whole distorted guitar thing starts to come in, and bands like The Who, who I love. I mean, I love The Who. Amazing artists. But this becomes more and more gritty as we go. you have people like Otis Redding doing Motown and others still a little on the edge in some ways also. And things are shifting quickly into the 1960s, and you start to get funk and social change and more rock and roll as we know it, hard rock. And I really attribute a lot of that to the Stones and the Who. And of course,
Yeah, right.
once get into
it's
that,
just so very. We're getting way into. I think we're getting far deeper into from away from the birth,
right.
with this. So, but yeah, listen, I grew up, came of age in terms of music and so on in the 70s, and I'm weird because I always have an appreciation for eras that aren't the current one.
Right.
So like growing up in the 70s and into the early 80s in terms of music, I wasn't necessarily enthralled with a lot of the stuff that I was listening to. Now today I have a far greater appreciation for it. But but I did have a kind of a look back. I tend to have a look back attitude on these things. So who else though? So you mentioned Bobby Darin. When did groups like when did Frankie Valli come along and that type of stuff?
Yeah, kind of in that era there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
but I'm always fascinated by the staying power of some of these groups, right? In terms of, you see resurgence with some of the early folks that were still alive and hanging around, right? They had their falling off, and then they people get to a certain age and they want to hear that music and so on, and they get a resurgence. But there are some groups that aren't just playing their old hits, but they hang around for a long time and do some interesting stuff. You mentioned, as we get into deeper stuff, the Stones certainly, I think, fit that. The Beatles were interesting because they developed. They were around for how many years? What was it, 10 years? I don't know. But they developed and changed in so many ways. And their later music was pretty different from their early music. I like both, but it's just a very different thing. And then I was always struck by a group like Frankie Valli being around in the early 60s. And then all of a sudden, like, they have hits, like I have a hit in the 1970s or the early 80s and stuff. So it does seem to, I think, rock and roll's credit. I guess a lot of people would say, how the heck do you define rock and roll today? And that's usually said as a derogatory thing towards current music or music of arguably this century, if you will.
Yeah.
But it becomes very expansive, and it is fascinating to see how diversified and different rock and roll becomes once you really get into the 60s. You can listen. I love the 50s stuff. I love the early stuff, but when you hear it, pretty much, when that's from. There's other stuff, I think, later on where you kind of like, well, I get it's this era, but there's some things that, are surprises. Look, the Beach Boys had a #1 hit in 1980 something, right? With Kokomo. So it's amazing how long some of these groups hang around, and then also how some of them develop and stuff. I'm rambling. Let me get back to you.
Yeah, some of them just keep reinventing themselves over and over again, and you often wonder if that plane never went down, what would have happened with Buddy Holly? He was a young guy. He was just really starting to come into his own,
Right.
and snuffed. It's like Richie Valens, another one. These guys were so young and so talented, and you kind of wonder, my goodness, if they didn't die in that plane wreck, what kind of amazing music would they have given us? And I think we would have seen the development kind of end up in a different direction in some ways. You mentioned people who make comebacks, and still a lesser known person like Wanda Jackson. She was in her 70s.
Well, now you're going to cover her in our extra.
Yeah, we
episode.
will. Yeah.
So don't get into this too much.
But no. I'm gonna tickle it a little bit here.
Okay.
But she ended up joining forces with people like Joan Jett. And that it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
So,
Wow. Yeah.
it's amazing how these people keep coming back around, and if they keep surviving, it's really amazing that they
So I'm going to
have
put you on the
a
spot. I'm
resurgence.
going to put you
Yep.
on the spot here. All right. So birth of rock and roll, the ones that we remember and the ones that we forget. And I'm going to put you on the spot. And if I annoy you with this, just say, I don't know. So who are the ones that you would take from that late 50, mid late 50s, who are the
Okay.
ones, it doesn't matter what number. I mean, if you have 2, 3, 5, whatever, that are the ones that came of age at that time, and people are just like, yep, I know that. I got it. I know who that is. And then who would you say are the top the top people groups from that era that you're frustrated that people don't know? There you go.
Well, yeah, okay. So, of course, Wanda Jackson is one that I'm frustrated people don't know.
Okay.
Sister Rosetta Tharpe, she was called the godmother of rock and roll. And she was a gospel singer, and she pioneered the distorted electric guitar as early as 1930s. In the 1930s, she was rocking. I mean, she was way out in front of it. More well-known people, Chuck Berry, Elvis, of course. You've got all those guys that died in the plane wreck, the Big Bopper.
Now, are they
not the
are
big
they remember? I'm
Haley.
going to ask
Haley,
you, are
that's
they
what I'm trying to think
remembered?
of. Haley, yeah.
Are
Yeah.
they
What's that?
remembered? Are that the folks that died in that, right? You
Yeah.
know that, I know that, but are they generally remembered, or is this something where you're kind of frustrated when you think about their names, and do people really know them?
Yeah, that's a good question. My musical tastes are so wide and varied, and a lot of times I'm not really paying attention to who's paying attention to who and all that. Buddy Holly, I think, is very overlooked and rarely known amongst a lot of people. And I'm a huge Buddy Holly fan. So I think he's one of those that would have just gone on a true greatness. I think he would have given Elvis a run for his money. Not as pretty as Elvis, kind of had that nerdy horn rim glasses thing going for him, but tremendous talent, and in the midst of evolving into something truly great.
And what about the
Little
other folks?
Richard is one who is really kind of an early adopter. Of course, he's a piano guy, but I think a
Do
lot of
people
people
remember?
don't.
What I'm asking, do you think people remember him the way they should? And I'll ask that of the other folks that died in that plane crash. I mean, I have my own opinion. I don't think people do
No,
in general.
I think you're right. For the most part, no. Richie Valens would be unknown if they didn't do a movie on him back in the 80s or 90s, whenever La Bamba came out. I think most people wouldn't have any clue who he was. Gene Vincent, there's one most people don't know. But Gene Vincent was an amazing talent, amazing guitarist, and a truly gifted musician. And a lot of people couldn't point him out if they heard him,
Mhm.
Um, there's a lot, yeah.
And well, this is the type of stuff that we hope people will take those names and go find their music. And it's easy today. I mean, whether you're on Spotify or YouTube, or, I use Amazon Music, for example, you can find these folks.
Yeah.
And it's well worth the exploration, because if you love rock and roll and you love today's music, you can find things in these folks that are just wonderful to listen to. It's one of the interesting things about the rock era that I will say. There tends to be, when you look at quote unquote the pre-rock adult stuff, right? I mean, I can remember my grandmother being a Bing Crosby person. Meanwhile, her daughter, my aunt, was a Frank Sinatra person, and they clashed. Now, today, I love both Bing and Frank, but that
Right.
was a clash at that time, right? That was a generational thing, which I find fascinating. And then my cousin, my aunt's daughter, was a huge Elvis fan. And actually, when Elvis Presley died, I can remember she cried. she cried when Elvis Presley died. So you've got all that, but there's something about rock and roll that if people are open to listening to the various eras, that I think you know, like you can find things that, like, my sons, right, have found music that they love, and it's from the era where I came, you know, I grew up in. And I think that's something about rock and roll that now it cuts across generations. And I don't know if you can say that about other types of music, previous eras, unless you're, again, a music aficionado. But I'm saying in general, that's something, again, I think a big plus for rock and roll.
I wish I could remember. I had it. I thought I had it in my notes, but I don't. Kind of the birth of the distorted guitar sound. And it was, it was an R&B band. It was an African-American band. And they had the guitar amplifier strapped to the roof of their car, and they were going to record. And the thing fell off the car. And the speaker cone broke. And the producer was kind of a handy guy. And he stuffed a bunch of like brown newspaper kind of stuff in there. And the thing was really fuzzy sounding. And they're like, "Oh, that sounds horrible." He's like, wait, I think we're onto something different. And
isn't it wild when you hear those stories? Right?
Distorted, fuzzy guitar thing was broken out of or born out of a broken speaker that fell off of a car, you know, and just really amazing how things like that happen and the world changes. And,
I love stories like that. I mean,
it's crazy. Man. Yeah. And I'm sad that I can't remember who it was, because you'd know it if I said it, but now I can't remember. Darn it.
Well, we are going to do a NeoNostalgia extra, as you mentioned, on who again? On
Wanda Jackson.
Wanda Jackson.
Yes.
We are also going to do, when you're talking, I mean, we dabbled, we pushed our way a little bit into the 60s, but we will be dedicating shows to the Beatles, the Beach Boys, Motown, over time, because they deserve, and so many other groups deserve, I think, episodes just focused on them. Before I let people go, I hope you'll become supporting the show, become a part of our NeoNostalgia community over at patreon.com/ or / I never know which it is, patreon.com / NeoNostalgia. There are all sorts of levels that you can join at there. You can become a friend of the show. You could be a NeoNostalgia nerd, and you can become a NeoNostalgia super nerd, and you can get all sorts of great benefits at various levels. So please check that out. And that will get you, by the way, access to our NeoNostalgia extra episodes and all sorts of other cool stuff. So, Craig, this was fun. We're going to come back to music, which is your forte. Next time I'll work on my radio voice for the intro and hopefully polish that up and make it even better. How does that sound?
That sounds great, Ray. Let's do that.
You're a radio guy, you know.
Hey,
you're an old radio guy. Yeah. So, yeah. Did you listen? You did talk radio. I got to ask you real quick. Did you ever do anything music related on the radio?
You know,
other than your band, which
I never did the DJ thing or anything like that. And I was always amazed when I was in Connecticut. I was on the talk station, and there was the rock and roll station was in the same building right next door, and there was a window between the two. And I'd be talking to someone about Jesus or something, and I look over, and there's a guy pushing his butt up against the window at me, and he's trying to make me crack up and stuff. But I'd go hang out with those guys. I can't believe how easy that whole DJ thing is. You record a 3-second snippet, you play a song, and you go have a smoke. It's just amazing. And they're like, "How do you talk for an hour straight? We don't know how you do that." I'm like,
real quick, I do have some radio in my background besides, talking as a guest related to economic stuff and so on, but, and my books and so on. But for a brief period of time, for a couple of years, I would fill in for a radio host in Albany, New York on Fridays. And it was a talk show. And I would go in with a stack of stuff to try to get people interested in something so they would start calling in. And that was just a gas. I love that. I mean, it was like 4 hours by myself.
Yeah.
It was insane.
It could be a grind. Yeah.
But it was, you know what? I enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. So there you go. All right, Craig, this is great. Folks, you subscribers, supporters, you'll get our Neo Nostalgia extra episode, and look forward to talking to you next time.
Neo Nostalgia was not recorded in front of a live studio audience.